Why did you set up ScottLogic and why the Northeast?
It goes back to my days working in Lehman Brothers. So, I had 10 happy years at Lehman Brothers, but then I had a small family, and I had the Northeast calling, which is where I'm from. So I didn't want to bring up my kids in London. So I was like, right, so what do I do here? I love my job. I love writing code in the financial services, but how do I do that up in the Northeast? And at Lehman Brothers, it was incredibly sort of, in the early days at least, it was a very entrepreneurial place. Yeah. So I'd actually created my own little sort of empire. I was head of fixed income analytics. I had my own graduate scheme. So I was running a mini business, if you like, within Lehman Brothers. So that really sort of putting those two things together, I then sort of put a business plan together for my bosses, and put it to them, and said, hey, I can hire some really, really smart people up in the Northeast, and they actually accepted the business plan. That was the start of ScottLogic. So it's sort of scratching my entrepreneurial itch and also getting me back in the Northeast.
For me, when I was applying for ScottLogic, it was just quite surprising to find that there was an organisation within Newcastle working for a global investment bank. You just didn't expect to find that.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite different back then, yeah. And so there's a lot of technology jobs in the Northeast now. But back then there really wasn't. And I remember when the Lehman Brothers were doing their due diligence on us, I had these sort of pretty scary investment bankers come up to the Northeast and interview the first tranche of people that I actually was looking to hire. And it was very, very different, and they were massively impressed. I mean, we were looking at very, very smart people from all sorts of different industries up in the Northeast, and they were incredibly. They loved it, and we went around the university, and they were fantastic. We went around the council; they were really fantastic and supportive. The Northeast was just a great place to set up ScottLogic.
Yeah, I guess it's a reflection that whilst the UK is quite London-centric, there's a significant amount of our population resides within London. There are a lot of smart people outside of London who want to do the jobs that are only physically possible within London. So I guess it was capitalising on that.
Yeah, I mean, creating a company which is solving really difficult problems. Actually, at the time in 2005, there wasn't a lot here. So actually, it was very easy to attract the best talent in the Northeast to this sort of nascent company. So it was great times.
How is ScottLogic so well placed to serve financial services, Lehman Brothers, and all the other large banks that we've worked with?
Well, I think that goes back to our heritage. I founded the company on the grounds of actually hiring very, very smart people. So everyone that I was hiring had to be able to get into an investment bank, into the technology department of an investment bank. Yeah. So everything was set up at ScottLogic to fit with investment banking. So that was our heritage. So the whole of ScottLogic was a sort of, if you like, a mini technology department of an investment bank. And that's sort of that heritage there. It started then, and then it's actually grown from there, obviously into other areas, other sectors and so on. But investment banking and financial services is certainly where it all started.
I guess other industries, whilst their domain differs from investment banking, they can recognise the calibre of engineers that investment banks demand or need.
Yeah, I mean, back in 2005, it was almost like peak investment banking, and it was sort of, the joke was that they were the masters of the universe and all the rest of it. And the bar was very, very high, and that's basically what we knew there was that sort of talent in the Northeast, and that's what we were hiring for.
Whilst investment banks are a very good fit for ScottLogic, the model where there are smart people outside of London who aspire to and want to do London-style jobs. Yeah. The inverse is true as well. Many organisations within London struggle to find the talent that they need. So it's different now than it was back then. These days, there's a significant amount of competition from the big technology companies, whether it's Google, Meta, and others. There's always competition for talent. As an alternative, if organisations like that look outside of London, there isn't quite so much competition. There are still significant pools of people that they haven't tapped into outside of London. So I think ScottLogic is good for the financial services industry as well.
Yeah, and being in in the northeast. People can get a lifestyle can actually that actually they couldn't get in the southeast, for instance. And get to do great problem-solving jobs.
Yeah, you can work for a bank and still afford a house by the seaside.
Yes,
which is
right,
a good combination with a drive. Good combination. Yeah. So over the many years that Scott Logic has been running, what are the most memorable, both good and bad, events in that history?
Well, I mean, the first event that springs to mind is the Lehman Brothers collapse, of course, which was 2008. So the company had just been going about 3 years at the time. And we were just starting to get clients outside of Lehman Brothers. But Lehman Brothers was pretty much our only sort of revenue source. And then this news happened. I remember the weekend very, very well. It was a Sunday night. And, it was, no one thought Lehman Brothers was going to sort of, crash and burn, but it did. And we came into work on the Monday, and really I thought our business was over because we didn't have any revenue coming in. So it was an absolutely surreal, crazy time. We had one other client at the time, but it wasn't enough to sort of keep us going. We were about 30 people, so it was kind of like, well, what do we do? Whenever I look back on the history of Scott Logic, that weekend, that next week was the defining moment. And when Lehman Brothers went down, it was chaotic. No one knew what was going to happen. So we just plowed on. We tried to communicate with our client who was breaking up, and it turns out actually at the end of it there was a silver lining, and it actually turned out to be a bit of a blessing in disguise, because what actually happened was, as Lehman Brothers blew up, that split up into two banks, Barclays and Nomura, both of which became our clients afterwards. So we started to diversify, which was something that we couldn't do before because we had restrictive covenants from Lehman Brothers. That happened, and then the people all went into different banks as well. So all of a sudden, we started to get business from lots of other financial services businesses. So it was actually a very positive, although it didn't seem at the time.
Yeah, much of our work was in the Lehman Live platform, which it was a market-leading platform. It had a fantastic reputation, and bits of it went to Nomura, bits of it went to Barclays Capital, and the people that knew how that system and that platform worked became quite valuable shortly afterwards. So to your point, it actually had a silver lining. But at the time, the phrase that you heard over and over again was too big to fail. No one seriously thought Lehman Brothers would go bankrupt. Everyone thought, just like the other large FS organizations that were close to collapse, the US government would step in. I think the decisions were being made hour by hour, day by day at that point in time.
And the amazing thing was as well that we actually had a lot of invoices that hadn't been paid. We thought we'd never get that sort of money back. But then as the sort of court proceedings went on, actually we figured out, actually, we're going to get some of that money back. And so actually after 9 years, and it did take 9 years, after the collapse, we got all of the money that was owed to us, which was hundreds of thousands of pounds. And so it was a real sort of bluebird payment, and it was a real sort of moment in our history also. And the question was, what were we going to do with that money? And it was at that point where, I think we kind of got together as a team. We talked about it, and really we wanted to do something good with that money rather than actually just put it in our own pockets.
Or throw a party.
Or throw a party. Actually, we did throw a party as well, but it was a bit too much for a party, wasn't it? It was so we did do a party, but it was quite modest. So and at that stage, that was sort of 10 years plus into the business. It was kind of right. Well, we really should put something back into the community, back into the world, and so. That was actually the start of a charity, which is called the Altitude Foundation, which is to help disadvantaged children in the Northeast actually get into technology and get good jobs and raise themselves up. So that was the Altitude Foundation. That is the Altitude Foundation, and today is sort of grown from strength to strength. Yeah.
And there's quite a close synergy between Scott Logic and the Altitude Foundation still, isn't there?
Oh yes, I mean we're very sort of closely linked, and so for instance we do a lot of work experience with the children and so on. And in fact, actually they're placed in this building right in the heart of Scott Logic, in the HQ of Scott Logic. The whole of the Altitude Foundation office is here.
So I guess another fairly significant point in ScottLogic's history and a significant point in any organisation's history was the COVID pandemic.
Oh my goodness!
And the impact that had. I mean, with ScottLogic, we've always had a exposure to and a dependency on financial services, which has a dependency on the overall economy. So things like COVID are really quite challenging for ScottLogic. So what were your thoughts about COVID and what happened then?
Well, again, it was surreal, wasn't it? We'd never seen anything like that happen. And what happened at ScottLogic was that work just dried up. Our clients didn't know what to do either. No, it was unprecedented times. So we just survived. We just tried to survive. We did see the actual amount of business coming in declining. So there was, at the time, if you remember, there was a furlough scheme. So actually, we could actually apply to get money in for work that we weren't getting. So we applied for the furlough scheme. And actually, that was a great scheme, I think, for the whole nation and for businesses across the UK. So we did that, and actually, over a few months, we actually took about £1 million from the government. But actually, after about 3 months, work started to come back as our clients started to sort of figure out how to continue, and that actually this wasn't the end of the world, and that we could still do business. So when that sort of work came back, we then took the decision that money that we'd taken from the government, actually we wanted to return it. It seemed like the right thing to do. So that £1 million, we actually literally wrote a check to HMRC and gave that money back. And I think that is another sort of defining moment for ScottLogic. It's the right thing to do. We could very easily have put that money into the coffers of ScottLogic, but we wanted to do the right thing. And I think our employees wanted us to do the right thing as well. But looking back on it, I think it was a real sort of proud moment. And I think actually history will look back at the COVID-19 and it will look at companies and how they actually behaved. And I'd like to think that ScottLogic behaved very, very well and very, very responsibly.
Yeah, we were, I guess, relatively fortunate that the core business model of ScottLogic can survive lockdown. It can survive COVID. The vast majority of the work that we do is already remote. We have people in the Northeast and other regional cities in the UK working for organisations in London and New York. But it was the sudden shock to the economy that was the impact to us. So fortunately, once the economic shock started to wear off, it was business as usual for ScottLogic after that.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
So in the pandemic, we were sort of, as well as trying to survive as a business, we actually also thought, well, is there something that we can do to do our bit for the nation, right? And so one of the things was we sort of reached out to a contact who was actually running NHS Digital at the time, and we just said, look, is there anything we can do? She said, yeah, sure. And so we then started talking to them, and we did a project.
Yeah, so one of the problems that the NHS had at the time was there was a very real need to profile all of the people in the UK and understand their exposure to COVID. And I guess most people who've been to the doctors and hospitals, you can see that their systems are a little bit fragmented. They don't have a single point of entry to understand the health and the medical history of individuals within the UK. So what they were doing was creating a thing called the shielded patient list, which was aggregating data from a wide variety of systems, because they needed to know who were the people that really needed to take the more extreme measures, shielding, keep themselves away from others. And it was very, very challenging. So we were one of a number of organisations that just rolled up our sleeves. We've got a lot of experience in challenging data problems. I mean, most of the clients that we work for, whether they're in financial services, public sector, most of them have got messy data sets. Most of them have got fragmented data. So that's the kind of thing that we're really quite familiar with.
We couldn't make hand sanitizer or face masks, but we could cut code.
Yeah, and there was certainly quite a lot of need for that. And we didn't do it for the glory, just like the giving back the furlough payments. We didn't make a big noise about it. We just, as I said, rolled up our sleeves and helped out.
Yeah. I think the social mission of ScottLogic, it's not really, we didn't start with a social mission. ScottLogic, I founded ScottLogic, and I guess I set the tone for ScottLogic, but it was the people who I hired who really sort of set the culture and set us on the road to our social mission. So I never claim that myself. I think there's a whole bunch of people, especially the early employees like yourself, Colin, who really sort of set the culture for us. And in terms of the social mission, that really sort of grew over time. So what was your sort of feelings about being an employee, one of those early employees?
You're right. The social mission was never at the forefront. It was interesting, worthwhile work with a bunch of like-minded people that you could learn from, become friends with. The culture was I guess simple. It wasn't written down as a mission or a set of values in the early days. That was an evolution that came later on, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was about 5 years before we actually started writing down what our sort of core values are, and then about 5 years after that, we then came up with the People Promise. Yeah. But it was a sort of evolution. Yeah.
The interesting thing is, core values, that's something that most organisations have. Yeah. And the core values that ScottLogic expresses are relevant to ScottLogic, but there's nothing in there that you'd look at it and go, well, that's quite unusual or out of the ordinary. The People Promise is something fundamentally different though, and that's something that I've not seen in other organisations. Yeah. So where did the People Promise come from?
Well, the People Promise was all about actually putting in place some actual release practical sort of measures to actually so that our employees could really sort of judge us. Whereas, when you've actually just got, words, they don't mean anything, but actually these are promises and you can hold us to account.
Yeah. And I think also an important point was the People Promise was drawn up at a point in time where we were expanding geographically, and that's where prior to the People Promise, we were probably in a couple of different locations, and creating a consistent culture in one office is relatively easy. Across two offices is a bit easier.
Yeah, it was all about scaling the business up, right?
But once you're distributed across 6 or 7 offices, creating a consistent culture and delivering on a set of promises becomes a lot harder.
And we had to hire a lot of more senior people as well, and we didn't want to sort of morph into one of those big consultancy firms. We wanted to be ourselves. We wanted to keep that sort of core of ScottLogic, what's made us good so far, actually expand on that. Yeah. And that was what the People Promise was all about. I think actually right from the start, that ScottLogic has been different. We've not been sort of money oriented. We've not really been even client oriented, dare I say it. We've been very much sort of focused around the people, and actually put the people, the employees at the heart of the business. So that's what I think is a differentiator. I think the other differentiator for ScottLogic, if we're talking about why is ScottLogic different, I think is technology. I think we're an unusual consultancy business in that we really get off on technology. And most consultancy firms are based around delivery, or they're based around making profit. We've been always around technology at the heart, and I guess that's. From a founder, I'm a programmer myself at heart, and I hired you early on as well, Colin. And I think that is one thing that makes us different, as well as the sort of people side of it is actually the technology side. How do you feel being the CTO of a technology-focused business?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. When I look at the larger consultancy organisations, they of course talk about technology all the time, but there's a lack of authenticity to a lot of it. Basically, you can tell that it's inauthentic because every single technology that arises, they get behind it. And that cannot possibly be right. We all see technology hype around us, and the larger consultancy organizations push the hyped technology because that makes good business sense for them. The more that they encourage their clients to use the hyped technology, the more revenue they make. We quite deliberately take a different stance there. We've got a podcast called Beyond the Hype, and the phrase Beyond the Hype is more than just the snappy title to the podcast. It's supposed to reflect our view, our perspectives on technology. We genuinely assess technology on its merits. And if we feel it lacks merit, we'll say.
Yeah. And in fact, this is actually also made it into our people promise, right? And that
Yeah.
we are always, and we said to our people that we are agnostic about technology. Yeah. So it's something very much deep at the heart of Scott Logic.
Yeah, I think that's very unusual. There are very few technology consultancies who are willing to call hype on technology that is growing in popularity.
Yeah, and so I think this makes us a unique consultancy firm, and I think that's something that we want, that we can grow from. I think we can expand the business based on our sort of people promise and on our sort of focus on technology. When I was founding Scott Logic, it was very much based on the model that I had at Lehman Brothers, and that was where I set up my own sort of graduate scheme. And so actually hiring very smart young people was at the core of Scott Logic. And to this day, it's still one of my sort of proudest moments is actually when I walk around the floor, I see all these super smart grads that we've actually hired. And actually 10 years on, a lot of them are still there. 15 years on, a lot of them are still there. And even we've got one graduate who is now a statutory director, Grey Mods, and our chief growth officer. So the actual, the whole sort of hiring young, smart people is at the core of Scott Logic, and it's, I think, really one of the sort of the things I'm most proud of in our history.
Yeah, and this relates to another sort of key aspect of Scott Logic as a consultancy business. I mean, most consultancy organisations, if not all of them, would claim to be people businesses, right, or put their people first. But in my experience, that isn't always true. There are a lot of consultancy organisations where they rely heavily on contractors or rapidly hire to fulfill the needs of a project, and they lack that continuity. Whereas you mentioned we have people who have been here 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. You get significant continuity of the people, which then translates to a very different experience for our clients.
Yeah, we've always been about sort of permanent employees. Again, that's one of our sort of people promises, and actually our clients really appreciate that as well. And we never really wanted to just stuff in lots of contractors into business just to sort of make a margin. That's not what Scott Logic's all about. We're all about long-term, permanent employees, and ideally sort of take them right from being graduates all the way through to being old men like us. Sorry, I'm an old man.
Sad but true.
Yeah.